Okay, so everybody can see the screen, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So good morning, everybody. And this is Module 6 of the Evolution of Science Fiction webinar series. And today we're going to be doing the mysteries and romances of science, the 19th century from the Sandman and Poe to Jules Verne and evolution. And there's some interesting graphics up there on the screen. Some of the early illustrations for Jules Verne novels like Journey to the Center of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And the image in the middle is more modern vision of Jules Verne's Off on a Comet, which I'll talk all about those three novels later on. And there's also some eerie pictures up there representing various Edgar Allen Poe stories, who we will talk about today too. And this series is based on my book series, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. They're the 5 volumes. Today, the content today comes from chapters 7 and 8 out of volume 1, Prometheus to the Martians. And something that I do every time as a starting point is just do a quick refresh of what we talked about last time. And our starting point last time is the Age of Enlightenment and the theory of progress. And in particular, we had some discussion on Condorcet's sketch toward an historical picture of the progress of the human mind, where Condorcet outlines the concept of progress, and Wendell Bell is called Condorcet the first modern futurist. We had a bit of a discussion, Debbie and I, as to whether Condorcet used the expression indefinite perfectibility or infinite perfectibility. And actually I went back and looked up his words, whether it was the indefinite perfectibility of humankind or the infinite. And it was indefinite, I found, from the original text. Although he did believe, in a sense, that humanity could evolve, in a sense, without limit. And he used that expression too. It's fascinating with Condorcet. I'm going to just stop for a moment. This is part of the review. The Condorcet believed that the two things we needed to get rid of to guarantee this indefinite perfectibility were tyranny and superstition. And he felt like through reason and science, we could obliterate both of those hindrances to human civilization and progress. It's funny that 200 years later, we're still dealing with the problems of tyranny and superstition. Although people often figure out what the difficulties are in terms of ensuring for a better future, you know, centuries may go by, and how much progress have we really made in actually addressing those issues? And Condorcet thought through education, we would be able to eradicate superstition and tyranny. And apparently we have not. And I talked about the fantastic Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift, and the first Alien Visitation written by Voltaire, Microscopic, and early journeys through the solar system back in the late 18th century, and journeys into the center of the earth in Holberg's The Journey of Niels Klim to the world underground, and talked a bit about utopias written post-Enlightenment, like the posthumous ones, and Mercier's The Year 2440. And then I talked about romanticism and romantic science, and recommended, if people haven't read, Holmes' recent book, The Age of Wonder, and discussed Banks and Herschel and Davy, and how all of them contributed as romantic scientists in opening up consciousness, human consciousness, even further to the wonders of nature and the universe. Herschel in particular, with the discovery of deep space and deep time. And then talked about the Gothic, and then talked about 2 famous Gothic science fiction novels, Frankenstein, and the most depressing novel I ever read, Granville's The Last Man. And finally, summarizing the whole thing, out of the 18th and early 19th century, humanity, at least Western humanity, looking toward the future with these conflicting emotions of hope and wonder on one hand, or terror and fear on the other hand. And I used two modern science fiction movies, 2001, a movie of hope and wonder, and Alien, a movie of terror and fear, to represent or symbolize these two emotional attitudes we have toward the unknown and toward the future. And both of them come out of the age of enlightenment and the age of romanticism. So that was a quick review. Now today, we're going to look at some interesting, very significant science fiction novels of the early part of the 19th century. The Sandman, Simpsonia, The Novel of the Future, and the original The Mummy. And then we're going to look at early 19th century science and how science got connected up with mysticism in the 19th century. And the second scientific revolution having to do with electricity and how that got involved in science fiction as well. And the first and second industrial revolutions. And then we'll look at Edgar Allan Poe, who was much more scientifically inclined than his stereotypical image of the horror and Gothic vision we have of him. But Edgar Allan Poe contributed into the evolution of science fiction. And we'll look at two interesting stories written right around the American Civil War, The Diamond Lens and The Brick Moon, both fascinating pieces about exploration into the unknown. And then we'll spend a big bulk of time on the extraordinary voyages of Jules Verne. And Jules Verne was the first globally visible, prolific science fiction writers. And there's a lot to be said about him, and we'll get into that. And then finally, we'll talk about the dual themes of evolution and entropy, two scientific visions of nature and the universe that become very popular in the second half of the 19th century and would influence science fiction and influence scientific consciousness in lots of different ways. So that's what we'll be discussing today. So let's go back to the beginning here, and let's go back to The Sandman. Now, The Sandman was written by E.T.A. Hoffman, and there's an image of E.T.A. Hoffman, a very, very interesting looking character, who was a writer of terror and Gothic stories and novels, very popular around the turn of the century. The Sandman, written just about the same time as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, is, in my opinion, much more frightening and eerie and strange than Frankenstein. The Sandman is a story about a young boy whose father is having mysterious meetings late at night with this strange character, Dr. Coppelius. And one night there's a huge explosion and the son finds the father dead and Coppelius has disappeared. And we follow this character, Nathaniel, who is haunted over his father's death, but is also haunted over a story that he's told by his neighbor about the Sandman. And the Sandman, of course, everybody is familiar with the popular fairy story that the Sandman would sprinkle sand into little children's eyes to help them to fall asleep. Well, the neighbor tells Nathaniel a macabre version of the story, that the Sandman throws sand in children's eyes, not to get them to fall asleep, but to get them to fall asleep and then steal their eyes and take their eyes to the moon, where the Sandman gives the eyes to his children on the moon. And Nathaniel is haunted by that mystery and that image and thinks that Coppelius is the Sandman, this evil character, and has killed his father. And when Nathaniel grows up, he becomes infatuated in love with this very beautiful but rather strange young woman called Olympia. And Olympia is the daughter of one of his professors. As it turns out, Olympia is a robot. that he becomes obsessed and in love with. And he re-encounters as an adult, encounters again, Coppelius, now under the name of Copula. And he's terrified by Copula, but at the same time, he's attracted to this robot he doesn't believe is a robot to begin with. Well, the long and the short of it is, at the end, the robot is stolen back by Copula, and the man ends up committing suicide. And I'm leaving out a lot of details in this, but this is a very eerie and bizarre tale. It's a tale about a robot, about whether robots have souls. It's a tale of obsession and fear. And it's done much, much better than Frankenstein, I felt, was done. Now, actually, this story, which isn't really that long, can be read up on the web. So if you're interested in seeing something very spooky, very scientifically informed, and we have an evil scientist in this, he's mad, but he's also evil, where Frankenstein might have been mad, but wasn't necessarily evil. In this case, Coppelius is very evil as well as being mad. And this is a really excellent example of synthesizing together science fiction with horror and also with the psychological, because Hoffman is a much better psychologist than Mary Shelley was. And he does a really convincing job of explaining how a child could grow up to be obsessed and fearful over this terrifying fairy tale that he's heard as a kid, and how he madly falls in love with a woman who could dance very well, recite poetry and sing, but doesn't really talk very much except for that. And he never realizes it's a robot till the end of the story. Well, anyway, that came out early on in the 19th century as a classic tale of both robots, in love with robots, and fear, and evil and mad scientists all rolled into one. Now, right around the same time, an American who wrote under the name of Adam Seaborn, Captain Adam Seaborn, wrote the first American utopian science fiction novel, Simsonia, which was another novel about journeying into the center of the earth. Now, remember back a century earlier, there had been stories about that as well, too. Well, here we have another one. Captain Adam Seaborn was probably a pseudonym for John Sims. And Sims actually almost convinced the United States Congress to fund an expedition to the North Pole to go look for a hole in the North Pole to travel into the interior of the earth. In the story, the character Adam Seaborn actually goes into the interior of the earth and finds this super technologically advanced society living inside of the earth, and the earth is envisioned as this set of concentric spheres rotating around each other, which is an idea that he got from Edmund Halley, the discoverer of Halley's Comet. So this is an example of how science fiction could actually influence, popular culture, because the United States government was almost ready to fund an expedition to go look for a hole in the North Pole. But it's often identified as the first American utopian science fiction novel because the world underneath is more advanced than the world above. A half a century later, someone else is going to come up with that idea in a much more influential novel and much more interesting, the title of which is Vril, the Power of the Coming Race, of this vision of there being advanced humans underneath us, and they're going to come up and invade us at some point in the future. Now, around the same time, we had somebody who, author Felix Bowden, who wrote a book called The Novel of the Future. And The Novel of the Future has been identified as the first novel in which a modern convincing case can be made for how to write a novel of the future and why it would be interesting to do it, why it would be provocative to do it, why you could write a novel that was both credible and fantastic at the same time. Now remember, Mercier had written a novel of Paris in the 25th century, but that novel was more lecture than it was actually a narrative. Bowden lays out how one would write a futuristic narrative. He's the first person that does, but he doesn't succeed very well at writing a convincing and fantastical narrative of a future human society. Now, here's a big surprise. The big surprise is that the person who actually wrote the first fleshed out futuristic narrative novel of the future, and it wasn't Shelley, of course, it was a woman, another woman, by the name of Jane Loudon. And the novel that she wrote was The Mummy. Now, everybody is familiar with The Mummy as a 20th century monster archetype, but the original Mummy, which she wrote in 1827, the Mummy actually was the good guy in the story. But the thing is that the story took place in the 22nd century. The subtitle is A Tale of the 22nd Century. And Loudon actually did a very good job of imagining human society 3-4 centuries ahead with lots of different technological advances, including global communication, moving houses, moving roads, electrified hairdos, airmail, et cetera, lots of technological invention, but she said it in the context of a story of this character who's obsessed with bringing a dead body back to life using electricity. The same idea as in Frankenstein. In fact, Loudon was inspired by Frankenstein, but she wrote the story much better in terms of the science of how one would go about reanimating somebody from the dead. And what the character in the story does is the character reanimates the pharaoh Cheops, or Cheops, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, from one of the pyramids in Egypt. And the mummy comes to life. And the character who regenerates him, reanimates him, faints out of shock, and the mummy leaves the pyramid and starts wandering around the earth. Well, this is a interesting novel for lots of different reasons, aside from what I already mentioned. Lots of technological scientific extrapolation. It reads, though, like a soap opera in that there's all these different conniving and stupid characters and romantic triangles and various manipulations going on behind the scene. And the mummy actually tries to guide humans toward ethical directions and defeat the evil characters in the novel. In the end, the mummy tells the central character that he did not reanimate him from the dead with electricity, but God did. And then the mummy dies, and that's the end of the story. Now, what Loudon does in this novel is she recreates the Frankenstein story, reanimating the dead, but it's not due to science. It actually ends up being due to God. But she does believe that scientific technological progress is something valuable, but it has to be guided by ethical and religious ideas. And so she spends a lot of time with the psychology of people of the 22nd century, not just the technology. But it is clearly the first fully fleshed out narrative of the future that's a science fiction narrative with a memorable set of characters and their various interactions with each other, and a really good discussion about human psychology 2 or 3 centuries ahead, which in many ways they're no different than us today, but with lots of technological advances thrown in. So it's a good example also of how science fiction can combine the technological and scientific with the ethical, psychological, and social. And then later on, the mummy turns into a bad guy in later versions of this story. But originally, the mummy was the good guy trying to help humanity out and was actually a reanimated Egyptian, a famous Egyptian pharaoh. Now, As we start moving into the 19th century further, we get the beginnings of the scientific study of electricity and magnetism. And lots of people will refer to this exploration of science and magnetism as the second scientific revolution. The first scientific revolution had been revolving around astronomy and mechanics with Newton and Kepler and Galileo. The second scientific revolution, which got into the study of the nature of electricity and magnetism, revolved around characters like Volta and Galvani, and then Michael Faraday, who unified together our understanding of magnetism and electricity, creating the first electronic motor, et cetera, et cetera. But electricity is a rather spooky reality. It comes out of the sky to begin with through lightning. And it's not something physical in the sense of being tangible. And people with mystical inclinations had lots of different associations with the idea of electricity, especially when it was discovered that electricity seemed to be the medium by means of which muscles and nerves in the body communicated and organized and functioned, because that didn't really come clear to people until the 18th century, that we're electrical beings in a sense, electrochemical beings. And out of this comes a character named Mesmer, who thinks that you could control the electromagnetic forces in the body, and that this could be a great treatment for various kinds of mental illness and mental health. And so we get the beginnings of mesmerism. And mesmerism eventually evolves into hypnotism, but at the beginning with Mesmer, it was the idea that we could put people in trances using various electromagnetic setups, and they would go into altered states of consciousness, and that one can treat them physically and mentally. His ideas didn't go over very well with the scientific establishment, but they did stimulate and influence lots of people who began thinking about how to use science or scientific apparatus to treat and manipulate consciousness. And this influenced, this whole line of thinking influenced Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe, who is the next person I'm going to be talking about here, was very much interested in hypnotism, in mesmerism, in the workings of the brain, of different alternate states of consciousness. Now, actually, he is much more of a scientifically inclined character than Shelley was, although you wouldn't necessarily associate that with him. I have a little quote here, and Edgar Allan Poe, who lived in the first half of the 19th century. The quote is from Thomas Disch, who's a science fiction writer and historian in regards to Poe. A starving artist, a devious liar, a drunkard, a sexual reprobate, and an all-around mad genius whom one could easily imagine inhabiting his own sensational fictions. And Poe is, of course, known for writing lots of horror and Gothic, but Poe also wrote lots of things that have strong science fiction elements to. And I'm not going to talk about the horror and Gothic so much as I'm going to talk about the science fiction stories. But keeping in mind that although Poe was interested in the horror and Gothic, he was also interested in science, and he wrote a whole set of stories that have science fiction themes. Dish, and here's the book that quote is from, The Dreams Our Stuff Is Made Of, by Thomas Dish, identifies 6 features of Poe which make him, in Dish's mind, the beginning of modern science fiction as opposed to Mary Shelley. Because if you recall, Frankenstein has very little science or technology in it. It's a story about psychological obsession. Poe, on the other hand, had lots of science and technology in lots of his stories. First of all, Poe was interested in altered states of consciousness, and science fiction has been interested all along in altered states of consciousness and in mesmerism and how that connects up with different states of consciousness. Dish says in Poe, your dreams come true, which could be your nightmares in this case, that Poe had this superior elevated attitude relative to normal mentality, that Poe believed there were higher levels of enlightenment and higher levels of consciousness that could be realized, and the everyday Joe on the street just never realized that. Poe had incredible visionary power, had created what Dish calls great special effects, very sensational and Dionysian kinds of scenes and characters, very grotesque characters, that he had a sense of humor and terror, that he often tried to be funny in his terror, and that one could vicariously participate in the divine madness of Poe. So getting into his stories, one lived through the very craziness that one saw embodied in his characters and saw embodied in him. And so Dish thinks that Edgar Allan Poe is the start of modern science fiction, given those qualities. Now, interestingly, there is a book, which you can just go out and buy, that's a collection of all of Edgar Allan Poe's science fiction stories. It's simply called The Science Fiction of Edgar Allan Poe. And you can get it on Amazon. Now, in there, the stories, and here are the dates of them too, that are definitely worth noting, that have strong science fiction elements. I'm putting up on the screen now. Notice these start around 1833 and they run up through 1849. Is that the last one? Yeah. Yes, 1849. So about a 15-year period, keeping in mind that Poe died very young. Now, by the way, I know there's a lot of text up on the screen. And just so that you know, I put together a text outline for each of the webinars. So all of these stories and everything else that I've been mentioning so far, you can access it. Just simply send me an email and I will send you the outline for the whole webinar today. So you don't have to remember all of the, not that you would remember all of these names. Now, only one story up there is not in the science fiction stories of Edgar Allan Poe. That's the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. That's the only one that's not up there, because that is actually a longer piece that is novel length and could not be included in the collection of stories. And that's actually a story that was inspired by Poe. Poe was inspired by Johannes Kepler, but this is a story of Arthur Gordon Pym journeying to the moon in a balloon. And Poe identified strongly with Kepler, who was a mystic and a scientist, and that story was inspired by Kepler's vision of journeying to the moon. And at the end, it turns out that it's not clear whether the main character actually went to the moon or not. But noteworthy in the story, there's a very elaborate technological description of how to build a balloon that could possibly journey to the moon. So Poe is definitely into the scientific credibility of his strange visions. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these stories, obviously, but I'll just point out certain key themes here. One theme that pops up repeatedly is if someone goes into a state of hypnosis or a state that is coma-like, what is the quality of consciousness in that state? Do they, in some sense, merge with cosmic consciousness? And that's an idea that Poe had too. And that perhaps when one dies, one doesn't lose consciousness, but just loses one's sense of individual consciousness. Because Poe actually had a cosmic theory that the universe began as a unified, organized, singular consciousness that then diversified into all of our individual consciousnesses, and in the end would come back into one consciousness. Several times in these stories, he goes into the future, where he visions a world destroyed by comets, a world in which cities have become polluted, a world in which we've forgotten the past. Other times he has these fantastical journeys where you go into a whirlpool and dive into the bottomless pit of the ocean. That story actually inspired Jules Verne. In fact, several stories that Poe wrote had an inspiration on Jules Verne, because Jules Verne actually studied Poe intensively because Jules Verne thought that Poe had this incredible imagination. We have a story here in which there is a conversation with a mummy, and the mummy who is brought back to life. Again, we have mummies being brought back to life, some words with a mummy, where there's a discussion of whether we made any progress over the last 3,000 years. We have, let's see, a story of time travel in here, a tale of the Ragged Mountains, where a character wanders through the woods and encounters a ghostly city that presumably hadn't existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. We have this general issue of how does consciousness connect with the physical world, inspired by his thinking about mesmerism, about the origin of the universe, and of course, in this comes up the issue about ghosts, because in several of these stories, the science fiction combines together with spirits from the dead. So there's a lot of sensationalistic and horrific and spooky elements mixed together with technological and scientific ideas, futurist ideas, exploring various other realms. Oh, in fact, the Unparalleled Adventure of one Hans Pfaall is another story about journeying up to the North Pole, where a cavity is found that could lead down into the interior of the Earth. So all of this, of course, mixes up together, and we have the terror, the Gothic, the science fiction, the futuristic, the consciousness stuff. And Poe actually is very, very interesting as a significant figure. He didn't last that long because he killed himself, not killed himself literally, but he drank himself to death by the time he was 40, I think. But he's a significant figure illustrating how science fiction gets mixed together with the spooky and mixed together with ideas about consciousness too. Now, next two stories that come along a little bit later that definitely have a strong impacts on what would come later on are The Diamond Lens, a short story by James O'Brien, who was a popular writer back in the mid-19th century. And The Diamond Lens is about a scientist who goes to see a medium and has a conversation with the spirit of Leeuwenhoek, the inventor of the microscope. And Leeuwenhoek tells him how to make the ultimate microscope, which is going to involve an incredibly big and complex diamond, which our main character finds his neighbor possesses one of. And the character kills his neighbor, steals the diamond, and makes the ultimate microscope, looks through it, and sees a microscopic world in which there is a beautiful, strange-looking woman, and he falls madly in love with her. Now, this seems to be the first story in which somebody envisions that there is a reality that exists down at the microscopic level that is sort of like our reality up here at this level, the macro level. And in the future, we're going to find lots of stories in science fiction where people journey down to these tiny, tiny levels of size and encounter worlds and universes down there. And this is the beginning of it, the Diamond Lens. In the end, he accidentally lets the drop of water that he's looking through with his microscope evaporate, which destroys the water down at the microscopic level, and the woman dies, and he goes mad because his love and fascination with the strange-looking woman comes to an end because he didn't take care of the little drop of water that he was looking through in the microscope. Now, around the same time, actually 10 years later, we get a story by Edward Everett Hale. Now, Hale was another popular writer around mid-19th century, And this story definitely falls into the history of science fiction, the brick moon, because this is the first story written that envisions the creation of an artificial satellite orbiting the Earth. And indeed, in the story, we have a set of characters who decide that they want to build a brick moon that is literally made out of brick, that's about 200 meters in diameter, and fling it up into the atmosphere so it could become a beacon in the sky for measuring longitude, just like the North Star is up there to determine latitude. And they create this 200-meter sphere with compartments in it, and they have a whole bunch of workers who come and are working on this, and they make it out of brick, and they have it on this flywheel that they're going to shoot up. And one night there's a flood where there's 40 people inside of the brick moon who are workers with their families, and the moon gets shot up into the sky and disappears. And 2 months later, they discover that it's up there orbiting the Earth, and the 37 people who are up there have adapted to the situation. An atmosphere got captured around the moon so they could walk around the surface of it. You see this image here with palm trees growing on the surface of the brick moon. And the people don't want to come back down again because they find the life up there is much more peaceful and not anywhere near so crazy and mad and rushed as the life back down here on the Earth. But this is the first artificial satellite shot up into the sky. And it's a very funny story. In the end, it's a critique, literally, of our modern frenzied world. And if you could get away from it and go live up in space with 35, 37 other people, that might not be a bad idea at all. Let's see. That's probably a good place to stop for the moment. I have to share my screen again, okay, and we'll start back in, and where were we? Okay, we're gonna start right there. Okay, Jules Verne. The Extraordinary Voyages of Jules Verne, the science-informed, techno-empowered extraordinary journeys of Jules Verne. Here's a quote from Jules Verne's editor, Hetzel, who Verne early on signed a contract with, where Verne produced most of his famous science fiction novels with. His aim, meaning Jules Verne's aim, is to outline all the geographical, geological, physical, and astronomical knowledge amassed by modern science and to recount in an entertaining and picturesque format that is his own, the history of the universe. That's how Hetzel describes Jules Verne. And Jules Verne was, from a very early age, extremely fascinated with science and nature, to the point where he was continuously creating note cards with science and nature facts that he would keep as a repository of information on the wonders of science and technology in nature. He was a data collector from very early on. From very early on, he also wanted to be a writer too. And he also was fascinated with traveling. His father didn't want him to do any of that. His father, I believe, wanted him to become a lawyer or something. But Verne also read from early on. He read Edgar Allen Poe and was very fascinated with Edgar Allen Poe and wrote a critique, an essay on Edgar Allan Poe. And he found Poe's imagination fantastical and strange and stimulating. And so Verne attempted to combine together an interest in science, an interest in travel, an interest in the wonders of nature into narratives. And he got this idea of trying to write novels of science. That's how he imagined it to begin with, novels of science. And the first one that he wrote and that attracted attention was 5 Weeks in a Balloon. Now, we'll just go to the next slide. And I have up here on the screen book cover images of what I consider to be his significant novels and stories relevant to the history of science fiction. Keep it in mind that for a long period of time, decades and decades, I think for 40 years, he wrote roughly 2 novels a year. So he ended up writing 50 or 60 adventure stories in his life. He was incredibly prolific. He became incredibly popular worldwide. And he wrote what he thought of as novels of science, adventure novels. And the first one, as I mentioned, was his novel 5 Weeks in a Balloon, which was not really a science fiction novel. It was a story of an adventure over Africa for 5 weeks in a balloon. And that's the one that Hetzel first bought and included in the series. And that was back, in 1863. And that got a contract with Hetzel to start writing these adventures with lots of science and nature. So in 5 Weeks in a Balloon, the first thing that comes out in there that's going to show up over and over and over again with Verne is how much scientific and naturalistic detail and facts he dumps into his stories. If you want to get oversaturated with how many damn different kinds of fish there are, read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It just goes on and on and on with one kind of fish after another kind of fish. You want a good intro to astronomy, read Off on a Comet. If you want a good intro into geology, read Journey to the Center of the Earth. Verne did what modern science fiction writers would call repeated info dumps. So he included lots of factualistic stuff from nature in his adventure stories. Now, after he did 5 Weeks in a Balloon, the next one he gave Hetzel, and I'm going to flip here so we can get a text list of them. The one he did after 5 Weeks in a Balloon was Paris in the 20th Century. Same year he gave it to Hetzel. Hetzel gave it back to him and said, no one's going to believe this and it's too depressing. Put it away. And he did. And I will come back to that novel at the end of this because it was finally published in 1994. Never published during his life, totally atypical in a lot of ways to what he wrote afterwards. But it's a very fascinating novel that he never published because Hetzel wouldn't publish it because he said it was too unbelievable and too depressing. And instead, he sent him A Journey to the Center of the Earth, and that is where Verne hit big. Because in A Journey to the Center of the Earth, he creates an extremely engaging and fascinating story that has a great element of humor in it as well, between one person who is reluctant, the student, and the other one who is the scientist, going on this exploration into the interior of the Earth. And Verne was quite well aware at the time that most people did not think the Earth was hollow. Most people by then believed that it was solid. And as you move down into it, it got hotter and hotter. So even by 1860, we had that idea. But Verne has about a 15-page exposition early on in the novel of why it's possible that maybe the Earth is not dense, but there are caverns leading down into it. And so Verne continuously tried to do this, is that he continually tried to make his adventure stories scientifically plausible and argue why it made sense to think that this kind of thing could happen. And whenever he described technologies, he always went into great detail about how this technology would be constructed, like in the ones to come on Journey to the Moon, the cannon and this ship. He had great intricate detail to make them look plausible. So he was extremely scientifically informed, extremely technologically detailed, much more so than anybody before him writing novels that were science fiction. He jumps to a whole new level. And Journey to the Center of the Earth, on top of it all, is a very engaging and funny novel. They never get to the center of the earth, by the way, but along the way, they meet all kinds of interesting characters, including giant humans and giant mammoths. And they see a fight between a plesiosaur and an ichthyosaur, who presumably are extinct, and lots of other stuff go on, and walk through a forest of giant mushrooms. After that, he wrote in sequence his 2 novels about going to the moon. Again, lots of technological detail. Again, we have adventuresome, courageous scientists. We have a new vision of the scientist developing now. Scientist as a hero, not as a mad or evil idiot or a neurotic like in Frankenstein. And again, in this case here, we never get to the destination because the cannon that shoots the capsule off to the moon ends up circling the moon, but it never really lands and has to come back to the earth in the end. But again, it's another technologically inframed or infused and with lots of scientific facts and a great story with great characters. And that's what Jules Verne was really good at, mixing together the science and technology with engaging characters and engaging stories. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, where Captain Nemo and the Nautilus, who became very famous icons in science fiction, appeared. And Captain Nemo is a mysterious scientist. Eventually, it's revealed that Captain Nemo, in a later novel, we find out was an Indian prince. And the Nautilus, and that's the one I mentioned. If you really want to learn about fish and underwater life, that's the novel to read, because he just goes on and on and on with fish and other kinds of aquatic creatures. He also goes and explores the lost city of Atlantis, and has a confrontation with a giant squid, blows up some ships because Nemo doesn't like the civilized world. And at the end, Nemo disappears. So Nemo is a mystery at the end. And we see the beginnings here of Verne and throwing into his scientist heroes some element of ambiguity regarding what kind of characters they really are. Around the World in 80 Days, he's very famous for that, but indeed, it's not really science fiction. It's just a great adventure with lots of description of different cities and cultures and parts of the world. Mysterious Island, Captain Nemo reappears. And in this case, it takes place around the time of the American Civil War, and Captain Nemo is involved in biotechnological experiments. And at the end of this one, Captain Nemo apparently does die. So Captain Nemo has a history that runs through his novels, Verne's novels. Off on a Comet is probably not as well known as some of the other ones I mentioned, but I found Off on a Comet the most interesting and entertaining of Verne's novels, because it's a great adventure, totally scientifically implausible. Imagine that a comet comes next to the Earth, breaks off a chunk of the Earth, that chunk stays lodged on the comet, and they go on a journey through the solar system on the comet. And it's very, very funny, and it's very strange, and it's a mystery story in which they're trying to figure out where the hell they are, because they don't realize at first that the part of the Earth that they're on is actually zipping through the solar system. But excellent novel. Again, we have some interesting lead characters who have lots of courage to them. But when we get to Bacon's Fortune, or the Bacon's Millions, we find 2 scientists now, one of whom is good, that has a lot of money to build a great peaceful city, and the second one who is evil, who builds a very militaristic city. The good guy is French, the bad guy is a German. And to throw in a little cultural history here, this is 1879. After the Franco-Prussian War, Verne and lots of Europe became apprehensive about the Germans and the German mentality of conquest. And so in The Bacon's Fortune, we find a obvious cultural stereotype that the Germans are militaristic and are the bad guys, and the French are the good guys. And this has got a lot of science and technology in it as well too. And in this case here, we have a utopian and dystopian vision in the same story. Now, Robert the Conqueror, or the Clipper of the Clouds, and let me just jump down so you could see the other one, Master of the World. These two stories go together because Robert was a scientist who creates an electrical powered airship that he thinks is superior to the air dirigible type of ships, and attempts to demonstrate that to the world, that his kind of airship is superior. But the world doesn't accept him, doesn't believe in him, and he turns into a kind of rogue scientist who then reappears again in Master of the World with a new contraption called the E.T.A, which is a combination automobile, submarine, airplane, and speedboat. It can change form, and he terrorizes the world. And he is a megalomaniac evil scientist. So we find that by the time you get down to the latter part of Verne's career, the scientists have morphed from being courageous and filled with good character virtues to turning into madmen. And this is sort of later in his career that this happens. The 29th century story, which is in the middle there between Robert the Conqueror and Master of the World, which was written in 1889, this short piece has more technological predictions in it about the future than any other piece that Verne wrote. A lot of Verne's stuff didn't really have to do with the future. It just had to do with these amazing technologies, amazing adventures, and lots of facts about nature. But in the 29th century, he does this incredible info dump of futuristic predictions of technologies, where in his vision of the future in the 29th century, everything is ruled and controlled by news corporations. So the news corporations control politics and science, and they control them all in the sense that they fund and guide all of the other institutions in directions that will facilitate noteworthy news stories so they can sell newspapers. And it's about an extremely wealthy manager of the biggest news company in the United States, which now has 75 states in it, by the way, by the 20th century, not 50. And it's just filled with lots of technological wonders, including the rejuvenation of the dead in there. And it's told in a very comical fashion. And finally, the last one I have up here, The Eternal Atom, is a story of eternal recurrence, that perhaps humanity has risen to great levels before and has been destroyed, and then risen again and has been destroyed, and risen again and has been destroyed. It's a cyclic vision of history. And it was actually written posthumously after, published after Verne had died. Now, let me go back to Paris in the 20th century, which is clearly the most futuristic science fiction thing he wrote. He envisions a 20th century Paris in which art, humanities, literature are gone. The world is ruled by science and economics. The central character is a poet who just wants to write poetry, but no one will pay him to do it. And he is depressed and feels alone in this world where women have lost their eros, their passion. They're not women anymore. They're part of the business world, okay? Where he can't find anybody who will give him a vocation, a job as a poet, and he can't hold on to jobs that he does have, but he has no skill in them. And he falls in love with this woman, but he becomes so poor and destitute that he spends his last few francs on buying her a bouquet of flowers, but she gets kicked out of the apartment, and he wanders through Paris, and eventually in the middle of a snowstorm falls down and dies in a cemetery, being haunted, he says, by the demon of electricity. And so Verne, he wrote this in 1863. It was probably polished up later on. He envisions a very bleak future where science and technology coupled with economics have destroyed the human heart. That is, art, passion, literature, music. Music now in the 20th century here is made by computers. And all of the other affective, romantic elements, what the romanticists had emphasized, are gone. That we are in a techno-dominated, cold, business-driven reality, and the central character dies of depression as a consequence of it. It's a very interesting novel, and it was, as I mentioned, published finally in 1994. Now,